The rope was the thing that stayed with him. Not the storm, not the cold, not even the 3 small bodies he had pulled from beneath the porch. The rope was the thing that lodged itself in the deepest part of Marcus Webb's mind and refused to leave, because a rope tied around 3 living creatures and hung beneath a porch in -17-degree temperatures is not an accident and is not negligence and is not the casual cruelty of someone who simply did not think. It is a decision, a deliberate and considered and executed decision. And Marcus Webb had spent 14 years as a Navy SEAL making and witnessing decisions under pressure, and he understood the difference between the things people do without thinking and the things people do after thinking, and whoever had tied that rope had thought about it, had chosen the knots, had chosen the location, had chosen the night, had chosen the storm, had made every choice available to them and arrived at this specific outcome. 3 German Shepherd puppies hanging in a blizzard at -17 degrees on a Vermont mountain where no one would find them until the storm had done what storms do to things that small and that cold, and that knowledge sat in Marcus Webb's chest like a stone that had been there so long it had become structural, had become part of the architecture of how he stood and how he breathed and how he looked at the world on the morning after the storm when the snow had stopped and the mountain was silent and the 3 puppies were alive in a cardboard box beside his wood stove making sounds that no creature should have to earn the right to make by surviving what they had survived. He had come to the Vermont mountain 18 months ago with 1 bag and no plan beyond the cabin, which he had bought sight unseen from a listing that described it as remote and private, and he had read those words as a promise rather than a warning, had read them the way a man reads words when he needs them to mean something specific, and the cabin had delivered on both counts. Remote enough that the nearest neighbor was 4 kilometers down the ridge and private enough that in 18 months, no one had appeared at his door without invitation except Emily Carr, the county veterinarian, who had appeared twice. Once to check on a doe he had found injured at the edge of his property, and once because she had heard from someone in town that the man on the ridge had taken in a litter of puppies during the November blizzard, and she had driven up the mountain road in her truck with the cracked windshield and the dog hair on the seats, and had knocked on his door with the specific directness of someone who has decided that knocking is a formality but is performing it anyway out of respect. And Marcus had opened the door and found her standing in the cold with a veterinary kit over one shoulder and an expression that combined professional concern with personal curiosity in proportions that were difficult to assess, and he had stepped aside without a word, and she had come in and gone directly to the box beside the stove with the efficiency of someone who has not come to be polite but has come to do something specific and important. That had been 6 weeks ago. The puppies were 6 weeks and 4 days old now by Marcus's calculation, which meant they had been approximately 10 days old when someone had hung them beneath his porch in a blizzard, which meant they had been born somewhere in the forest or in a structure near the forest and had lived their first 10 days of existence in some condition that Marcus did not want to imagine in too much detail because the details he could infer from the physical evidence of their condition when he found them were already sufficient to produce in him a quality of cold-focused anger that he recognized from operational contexts and had learned to manage carefully because the cold-focused anger was useful when it was directed correctly and dangerous when it was not. He directed it at the box of paperwork on the table that he was working through each morning, the paperwork that the county sheriff's deputy had left him after taking his statement about the night of the blizzard, the paperwork that represented the official record of what had been done to 3 living creatures on a Vermont mountain in November, the paperwork that was his contribution to the process of ensuring that whoever had tied that rope was identified and held accountable for having tied. The puppies did not know about the rope. The puppies knew about the box, which was warm, and the blanket in the box, which was soft, and the food that appeared at regular intervals from the large quiet human who moved around the cabin with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned that unnecessary movement is a form of waste, and they knew about each other, about the specific warmth and weight of being pressed against another small body in the cold, and they knew about the sounds that the cabin made at night, the settling of the logs and the voice of the wind in the eaves and the occasional pop of the fire, and these things constituted the entirety of their world, and they found the world sufficient and expressed this finding in the way that very young dogs express all findings, which is with the complete and uncomplicated physical directness of creatures who have not yet developed the capacity for ambivalence. Marcus had named them on the 3rd morning. He had not intended to name them. Naming was a form of attachment, and attachment was something he had been managing carefully for 18 months. Managing it the way you manage a structural weakness in a building, not by pretending it is not there but by being aware of its location and not putting additional weight on it. And he had managed it successfully through the 18 months on the mountain and through 6 weeks with the puppies by telling himself each morning that the naming was unnecessary and could wait. And on the third morning he had looked at the largest one, the one with the dark mask around his eyes, who had been the most stable of the 3 from the first night and who now looked up at Marcus from the box with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated assessment, such direct and total attention, that Marcus had said out loud without planning to, "Atlas." And then he had looked at the middle one, the female with the white blaze on her chest, who moved with a kind of considered elegance even at 6 weeks, even in a cardboard box, and had said, "Sable." And then he had looked at the smallest one, the one who had frightened him most on the first night, whose breathing had been so faint that he had held his own breath to hear it, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "Wren." Because wren was a small bird that survived Vermont winters by being exactly what it was, completely and without apology, and that seemed like the right kind of name for the one who had come closest to not surviving at all. Emily Carr had approved of the names when he told her on her second visit. She had approved of them in the specific way that a person approves of something they were not expecting to approve of, with a slight change in expression that was not a smile exactly but occupied the territory adjacent to one, and she had said, "Atlas, Sable, and Wren," and had looked at the 3 of them in their box with the assessing eyes of someone who is simultaneously a professional evaluating patients and a person encountering something that produces a response the professional training does not entirely account for. And then she had opened her kit and begun the examination with the thoroughness that Marcus had noted on her first visit and that he had come to understand was not just professional standard but personal standard, the thoroughness of someone who believes that the thing in front of you deserves your complete attention regardless of what else is demanding it. She was 34 years old, Emily Carr, and she had been the county veterinarian for 7 years, having returned to Vermont after a residency in Boston that she had completed and then left. Left not because she had failed but because she had looked at the life the completion of it would produce and had found that life to be correct in every external measure and insufficient in some internal one that she had not been able to name precisely but had trusted completely, the way you trust the readings of an instrument you have calibrated carefully over time. She had returned to the county where she had grown up and had taken the veterinary practice from Dr. Hennessy, who was retiring, and she had been doing the work for 7 years with the steady commitment of someone who has found the right thing and knows it, not with the triumphant certainty of someone who searched for years and found it dramatically, but with the quiet ongoing confirmation of someone who makes the right choice each morning when they get up and do the work again. She lived 12 kilometers from Marcus's cabin in a house at the edge of the town of Calder that had a large barn attached to it which served as the overflow treatment space for the animals she could not transport easily, and a smaller space inside the house itself that served as her office and that was full of the organized chaos of someone whose professional life and personal life occupy the same geography and have reached an accommodation with each other. She had a border collie named Frost who was 11 years old and who moved through the world with the dignified deliberateness of an elder statesman and who regarded the addition of 3 German Shepherd puppies to Emily's professional caseload with the philosophical equanimity of an animal that has processed many developments over 11 years and found equanimity to be the most productive response to most of them. On her second visit to Marcus's cabin, Emily had brought supplies that he had not asked for but that she had assessed he would need: puppy formula and a heating pad and a scale for monitoring weight and a small notebook for recording the daily measurements that would tell them whether the trajectory of the 3 small lives was the one it needed to be. And she had set these things on the table beside the box with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who is not waiting to be thanked and is not performing generosity but is simply doing the next correct thing. And Marcus had watched her do this and had thought that he had not been in the presence of someone who simply did the next correct thing without performance or expectation in a very long time, and the thought had produced in him something unexpected, a quality of ease that he had not felt in a place that was not solitary in 18 months, and he had not known what to do with the ease except stand there and experience it, which was what he had done. The puppies grew. They grew with the specific urgency of creatures that have been behind schedule and are making up for lost time, growing in the way that things grow when they have been given what they need after being denied it, with a completeness and a speed that was almost visible from day to day, Atlas putting on weight and breadth in a way that made his early fragility seem improbable, Sable developing the long-limbed elegance that the white blaze on her chest seemed to have promised from the beginning, Wren remaining the smallest but revealing in her smallness a precision and an attentiveness that made size seem like the least relevant measurement. By the time they were 8 weeks old, they were out of the box and into the cabin, and the cabin had changed its nature entirely, had become a space that was navigated rather than occupied, full of the particular chaos that 3 German Shepherd puppies at 8 weeks produce in any environment that has been organized around a single adult human who has been alone for 18 months and has developed habits of order that are now being tested comprehensively. Marcus adapted. He adapted with the methodical practicality of someone who has been trained to function in environments that are not what they were when the mission was planned, adjusting and recalibrating without complaint or drama, moving things higher and securing things better, and learning the specific logic of the chaos that Atlas and Sable and Wren were generating, learning where they were likely to be and what they were likely to be doing and what the specific quality of silence that preceded a bad decision sounded like, and he used this knowledge to manage the situation with a competence that surprised him slightly, surprised him because the managing of it required a quality of attention that he had not been directing outward in 18 months and had not been sure he still had, and the having of it, the discovery that it was still there and still functional, was not something he had expected to find in the management of 3 German Shepherd puppies in a Vermont cabin in December, but was something he found there regardless, and he filed it under the category of things the mountain had given him that he had not come here looking for. Emily came twice a week through December. She came on Tuesdays and Fridays with the regularity of someone who has added something to a schedule that was already full because the something is important enough to justify the fullness, and she came with her kit and her notebook and her scale, and increasingly without the formality of professional purpose, increasingly with the quality of someone who is coming because the coming itself has become the thing rather than the professional task that initiated it. She and Marcus developed a routine around the visits that neither of them had designed and both of them maintained: the coffee on the stove when she arrived, the shared review of the weight logs, the examination of the puppies that Atlas submitted to with dignified resignation and Sable regarded as an opportunity for thorough personal assessment of the examining equipment, and Wren approached with the focused scientific interest of a researcher who has found a new dataset, and then the hour afterward when the professional purpose was complete and they sat at the table and talked. The talking had begun with the paperwork about the rope and the investigation that the sheriff's deputy was conducting and the things that Marcus had observed in the weeks after the storm that he had added to his own record, small details that might or might not be relevant, tire tracks on the Forest Service road that had been there the morning after the storm and gone by the afternoon, a section of fence line on the eastern edge of his property that had been disturbed in a way that was inconsistent with weather damage, the sense he had on 2 occasions while walking the ridge of being observed from the tree line, a sense he trusted without being able to substantiate it, trusting it the way he trusted all the readings his operational experience had calibrated him to take, not because he could prove them but because the instrument that produced them had been tested in conditions that left no room for unreliability and had not failed yet. Emily had listened to these observations with the serious attention they deserved, had added some of her own, had mentioned a conversation she had overheard at the feed store in Calder 3 weeks after the storm in which a man she did not recognize had asked specific questions about the cabin on the ridge and who lived there and whether the occupant had any dogs, questions whose specificity had struck her as unusual at the time and that struck her as more than unusual now, and she had described the man with the precision of someone who has been trained to observe and retain, and Marcus had listened and said nothing for a moment and then had said, what was his approximate height? And Emily had said, 6 feet, maybe an inch more, and Marcus had said, build, and Emily had said, not heavy, lean but not thin, the kind of lean that comes from work rather than absence, and Marcus had looked at her with an expression that was the closest he came to being visibly impressed and had said, that is a precise observation, and Emily had said, without particular emphasis, I grew up on a farm, you learn to assess animals and the people who work with them, and Marcus had said nothing more about it but had written it down in the notebook he kept on the table, written it in the small precise script of someone who has been trained to record information in ways that can be retrieved accurately, and the act of writing it down beside his own observations had produced between them a quality of shared purpose that was different from the professional relationship of veterinarian and patient owner and different from the neighborly relationship of two people who live within driving distance of each other and different from anything Marcus had experienced in 18 months of careful management of his connections to other people. And he had not named it that evening but had noted it the way he noted all the significant data points his environment produced, with attention and without immediate conclusion. The investigation into the rope moved slowly through December and into January. The sheriff's deputy, a woman named Petra Hollis who was thorough and unhurried in the way of someone who has learned that the cases that matter are the ones you do not rush, came to the cabin twice more after the initial statement, each time with new questions that told Marcus the investigation was moving in a direction he had assessed as likely, the direction that led toward the eastern part of the county where the Forest Service road ended and where there were 3 properties that had been flagged in Petra's preliminary canvassing as warranting further attention, properties whose occupants had responded to standard questions with the specific quality of evasion that is distinguishable from privacy if you know what privacy sounds like and what evasion sounds like, and Petra Hollis knew the difference. Atlas had begun to demonstrate the qualities that Marcus had named him for. He was 13 weeks old and already showing the broad chest and the deliberate gait of a dog who has decided that the world is a thing to be moved through with intention, who pauses before committing to a direction and moves through the chosen direction with complete commitment once the choice is made, who positions himself between the people he is attached to and the direction from which uncertainty comes without being instructed to do so and without making a performance of it, simply doing it the way he did everything, with the quiet matter-of-fact competence of a creature for whom the right action is self-evident. Sable had developed a relationship with Emily that had the quality of a mutual recognition, a sense between them of two creatures who have assessed each other and found the assessment favorable and are now proceeding on the basis of that assessment with the confidence of a concluded negotiation, Sable choosing Emily's feet when Emily was in the cabin the way a plant chooses the direction of the light. Not dramatically but with complete consistency and complete naturalness. Wren watched everything and missed nothing and was the first of the 3 to learn that the sound of the truck on the mountain road meant Emily and that Emily meant the good things that Emily brought with her, and she stationed herself at the window 12 minutes before Emily's truck appeared on the ridge, which was longer than the sound of the truck would have been audible from the cabin, and Marcus had clocked it on 3 separate occasions and found the 12 minutes consistent and had thought about what that meant and had not arrived at a conclusion that his operational training could fully account for. In January, the investigation produced its first concrete result. Petra Hollis came to the cabin on a Thursday morning with the expression of someone carrying information that has weight and is being carried carefully, and she sat at Marcus's table and told him that the property at the end of the Forest Service road belonged to a man named Gerald Fitch, 51 years old, previously cited for animal welfare violations in 2 separate incidents 7 years apart, the first involving the disposal of a litter of mixed-breed dogs in a manner that the citation had described as inhumane and the second involving the neglect of a group of working dogs on a property he had leased for hunting, and that Gerald Fitch had been interviewed the previous week and had denied any knowledge of the puppies and had provided an alibi for the night of the blizzard that Petra described as partial, meaning it accounted for some of the night and not all of it, and that she was continuing to develop the case and wanted Marcus to know the direction it was taking. Marcus had listened to all of this and then said, "The puppies were 10 days old when I found them, which means they were born approximately 10 days before the blizzard," and Petra had said, "Yes, which means there is likely a mother somewhere," and Marcus had said, "Yes," and they had sat with that for a moment, and then Marcus had said, "I want to know if there is a mother," and Petra had said, "So do I." The mother was found on a Saturday in late January. She was found not by Petra Hollis and not by Marcus Webb but by a 12-year-old girl named Clara Brandt who was walking the Forest Service road on her way home from her friend's house and who found a German Shepherd lying in the snow at the base of a pine tree 40 meters from Gerald Fitch's property line, lying in the snow with the specific stillness of an animal that has been there long enough to become part of the landscape, and who recognized immediately that the stillness was not the Stillness of death because she had grown up in the country and knew the difference, and who sat down beside the dog in the snow and called her mother on her phone and then called the number her mother told her to call, which was the county veterinary practice, which was Emily Carr. Emily arrived in 22 minutes with her truck and her kit and the focused urgency of someone who has received information that requires urgency and is responding to it completely, and what she found at the base of the pine tree was a German Shepherd female, approximately 2 years old, severely underweight, with injuries consistent with having been kept in a confined space under inadequate conditions for an extended period, with milk still present indicating she had been nursing recently enough that the presence of milk told Emily something specific and important about the timeline, told her that this dog had been nursing puppies within the last 6 to 8 weeks and that those puppies had been removed from her abruptly, removed in the way that things are removed when the removing is done without care for what the removal costs the one being removed from, and Emily had knelt in the snow beside this dog for a moment before opening her kit, had knelt there with her hand on the dog's side, feeling the too rapid heartbeat of an animal whose body is at its limit, and had said something quietly that Clara Brandt, standing 3 feet away, could not quite hear but that Clara would remember for years afterward, not the words, which she had not been able to make out, but the quality of them, which was the quality of a promise. Marcus was at the cabin when Emily called him. He was at the table with the weight log and the notebook, Atlas asleep across his feet with the proprietorial ease of a dog who has assessed the available sleeping locations and determined that the available human foot is the optimal one, and his phone rang and he answered it and Emily told him what she had found and where and what condition the dog was in and what she needed, and Marcus said, "Bring her here," said it before he had consciously decided to say it, said it with the immediacy of a decision that does not require deliberation because the correct answer is self-evident, and there was a brief silence on the other end of the line and then Emily said, "Are you sure?" and Marcus said, "Yes," and Emily said, "I'll be there in an hour," and Marcus was already standing, Atlas lifting his head from the floor with the alert interest of a dog who has read a change in the environment and is assessing its implications, and Marcus said to him, "We're getting a visitor," and Atlas regarded him steadily with those dark masked eyes and then stood up and shook himself and went to the door and sat down facing it, and Marcus looked at him for a moment and thought, "Yes, apparently we are." The dog that Emily brought to the cabin an hour later was carried in from the truck in Emily's arms because her legs were not reliable enough for the steps, carried in with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something precious and fragile, and Marcus held the door and Emily carried her to the blanket he had already laid beside the stove and set her down with a gentleness that was total, and the dog lay on the blanket and looked at the ceiling with the exhausted eyes of an animal that has been through more than it should have been asked to go through and is not yet sure whether the current situation represents a continuation of the previous one or something different, and Marcus crouched beside her and let her smell his hand without touching her, let her take the time she needed to make her own assessment. And she smelled his hand for a long moment and then turned her head and looked at him, and he looked back at her and thought, "She has been deciding whether to trust anything for a long time and has had very few reasons to decide yes," and then she put her chin on his hand, just rested it there, just the weight of her chin, and he felt something move in his chest that had been stationary for a very long time. Emily named her first, said it almost involuntarily while she was recording the dog's vitals in the notebook, said, "She needs a name," and Marcus said, "She does," and there was a pause and then Emily said, "River, because she has been trying to find her way somewhere the whole time," and Marcus looked at River lying on the blanket with her chin still resting on his hand and thought about rivers, about the way they move through landscapes that resist them, about the way they find the path that is available rather than the path that is easy, about the way they arrive where they arrive not because it was the intended destination but because the terrain and the current and the specific gravity of their situation brought them there, and he said, "Yes, River is right," and Emily wrote it in the notebook and River closed her eyes and her breathing slowed towards something that was not quite sleep but was closer to rest than she had been in a very long time. The reunion happened on a Sunday morning 9 days after River arrived at the cabin, and it was not staged or planned or arranged for any audience because Marcus Webb did not stage or plan or arrange things for audiences, but it was witnessed by Emily Carr who happened to be there for the Tuesday visit that had been moved to Sunday because of a scheduling conflict. and she stood in the doorway between the main room and the small back room where River had been sleeping during her recovery, stood there with her coffee cup in both hands and watched what happened when Marcus opened the connecting door and Atlas and Sable and Wren came through it for the first time, came through it with the cautious, controlled curiosity of puppies who have been told by every signal in their environment that something significant is on the other side of this door and are approaching the significance with the appropriate level of attention. Anne River lifted her head from the blanket and went still in the specific way that animals go. Still when something has reached them at a frequency below the range of ordinary perception, and then Atlas crossed the room in 3 steps and pressed his nose against River's nose, and something happened between them that Emily Carr, who had been a veterinarian for 7 years and had witnessed many things that her training had not prepared her for, would describe afterward as the closest thing to recognition that she had ever seen pass between 2 living creatures, a recognition that was not surprise because surprise implies the possibility of a different outcome, but the confirmation of something that had been true continuously through the weeks of separation and was now, in this specific moment, being formally acknowledged. Sable came next, and then Wren, and River made a sound that Marcus had not heard her make in 9 days of recovery, a sound that came from the place in a creature where the things that cannot be said in any other way are kept, and she put her head down and let them press against her, and the 3 of them pressed against her with the simultaneous purposefulness and naturalness of things returning to where they came from, and Marcus stood in the doorway where Emily had been standing and watched this and said nothing and felt the stone in his chest, the one that had been there since the night of the blizzard and before the night of the blizzard and before he had come to the mountain, felt it shift in a way it had not shifted in a very long time. Shift not catastrophically but definitively, the way something shifts when the thing that has been holding it in place is no longer present. Emily came to stand beside him in the doorway and they stood there together and watched River with her 3 puppies and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the not saying anything had the quality of a shared understanding that was more complete than what language would have produced, and then Emily said quietly, "Gerald Fitch had 4 litters in the last 2 years. And Marcus looked at her and she looked back at him with the expression of someone delivering information they have been carrying for a while and are now setting down, and she said, "Petra told me yesterday 4 litters in 2 years. River was the breeding dog," and Marcus said nothing and looked back at River and the puppies and felt the cold focused anger that he had been managing carefully through the investigation settle into something else, something colder and more permanent, not rage but resolve. The specific quality of resolve that forms when you understand the full scope of what has been done and have decided completely and without reservation what your response to that scope will be. The case against Gerald Fitch was built through February with the methodical patience that Petra Hollis brought to everything, built from the physical evidence that had been collected and the testimony that had been gathered and the veterinary documentation that Emily had provided with the thoroughness and precision that her 7 years of practice and her own quality of resolve had made possible, documentation that described in clinical and accurate detail the condition of River when found and what that condition indicated about the conditions she had been kept in and for how long, and the documentation was not written with anger or advocacy but with the plain factual directness of a professional who understands that the facts themselves, stated clearly and completely, are the most powerful argument available and require no embellishment. Marcus had contributed his own statement, an account of the night of the blizzard and everything that had followed it that was written in the same plain precise language as Emily's documentation, the language of someone who has been trained to record events accurately because accuracy is the foundation of every subsequent decision. And Petra had taken both documents and added them to the case file that was growing toward the threshold that the county prosecutor needed to move forward. Marcus trained Atlas and Sable and Wren through February with the consistency and the patience that had surprised him in December and that had ceased to surprise him by February because he had come to understand that the consistency and the patience were not resources he was drawing down but resources that the work itself was generating, that the training was producing in him the same qualities it was developing in them, that the practice of showing up each morning and doing the work carefully and completely was itself a form of the thing it was trying to create, and he understood this not as a discovery he had made but as a confirmation of something he had known and then forgotten in the years before the mountain, something about the relationship between doing a thing and becoming a thing, about how the doing and the becoming are not sequential but simultaneous, And the understanding of it was not dramatic, but it was real and it was his, and he kept it the way you keep things that are genuinely yours without needing to display them. River recovered. She recovered with the specific determination of an animal that has been given what it needed after being denied it and is making full use of the provision, gaining weight and strength and moving through the cabin with increasing confidence. Moving through it at first carefully and then with more ease and finally with the particular quality of ease that belongs to a creature that has assessed an environment thoroughly and concluded that the environment is safe and that the safety can be trusted. Not with the naive trust of something that has never been hurt, but with the considered trust of something that has been hurt and has chosen trust anyway, which is a different and more complete thing. She and Atlas had developed a relationship that Marcus watched with the attention he gave to all significant developments in his environment, a relationship that had the quality of two creatures who understand their relationship to each other at a fundamental level and are operating from that understanding continuously, Atlas positioning himself near River without crowding her, River allowing the proximity without demanding it, both of them finding in the other's presence a quality of ease that neither of them produced in any other combination. Emily had begun to stay longer on her visits. She stayed past the professional purpose and past the reviewing of the weight logs and past the second cup of coffee and into the evening, stayed with the naturalness of someone whose presence in a place has become part of the place's normal configuration, and Marcus had noted this development with the same attention he gave to all the data his environment produced and had found that his response to it was uncomplicated, that the staying was something he had made no movement to prevent and had found himself making small movements to facilitate, that the fire was consistently well stocked on Tuesday and Friday evenings and that the provisions for dinner were consistently sufficient for two people and that these things had happened without deliberate decision on his part, had happened the way things happen when a part of you that you have not been consulting has been making decisions on your behalf and has been making them correctly. They talked about many things in those evenings. They talked about the investigation and about the puppies and about River and about Emily's practice and about the cases she carried home in the specific way that veterinarians carry cases home, not in files or reports but in the particular quality of attention they give to the ones that stay with them, and they talked about the county and the mountain and the seasons, and occasionally and with increasing frequency they talked about the things that had brought each of them to where they currently were, not with the deliberate excavation of people who are performing intimacy but with the natural emergence of things that come to the surface when you are in the presence of someone you have stopped performing for, and what came to the surface came carefully and was received carefully and was not pushed for or pulled from but simply allowed, and the allowing of it on both sides was itself a form of something that neither of them named but both of them recognized. Marcus told her about the mission. He told it the way you tell things you have carried alone for too long, not with drama but with the flat precision of someone reading coordinates, and the mission was the last one before he left the teams, the one that had gone wrong in the specific way that missions go wrong when the intelligence is incomplete and the variables are more than the planning accounted for, the mission from which he had returned with his body intact and his record clean and the hollow place inside him that the official assessments had not been designed to find and had not found, and that he had managed for 18 months on a Vermont mountain by filling it with solitude and silence and the specific discipline of a life stripped to its essentials, and he told it plainly and completely, and Emily listened to all of it with the serious attention it deserved, and at the end of it said nothing for a moment and then said, "You came back," and Marcus said, "Yes," and Emily said, "Not everyone does," and Marcus said, "No," and there was a silence between them that was not empty but full of the specific weight of what had been said and what was understood about what had been said, and then Emily put her hand on the table next to his hand, not on his hand, just next to it, and he looked at her hand next to his hand and thought about River choosing to rest her chin on his hand on the first night, the weight of that choice, and he turned his hand over on the table and Emily's hand was there and the contact was simple and complete and neither of them said anything about it. And outside the cabin the Vermont winter continued its long work, and the fire spoke in the stove, and Atlas lay across Marcus's feet, and Sable lay at Emily's feet, and Wren lay between them watching the door with those precise attentive eyes that missed nothing, and the cabin held all of it in the quiet way of a place that has become the right place for the things that are happening inside it. The prosecutor filed charges against Gerald Fitch in the first week of March. The charges were substantial, reflecting the scope of what the investigation had uncovered, And Petra Hollis came to the cabin to tell Marcus personally, came on a Wednesday morning that was not a visit day but that she had made into a visit anyway because she felt the news deserved to be delivered in person and because she had come to understand over the months of the investigation that Marcus Webb was someone for whom the manner of a thing's delivery mattered, someone who read the quality of how something was done as closely as the content of what was done, and she told him the charges and he listened to them all and then said, "River," and Petra said, River's condition was central to the filing, yes, and Marcus said, "Good," and Petra said, "I thought you'd want to know that," and Marcus said, "I did, thank you," and Petra stood up to leave and then paused at the door and said, "You built something good up here," and Marcus looked at her and said, "I didn't build it alone," and Petra nodded once and went to her vehicle and drove down the mountain road, and Marcus stood in the open door for a moment with Atlas beside him and watched the truck until the trees took it and then turned back inside. Spring arrived in the mountains of Vermont the way spring always arrives there, not as an event but as an accumulation, a slow revision of the terms of the world, the snow receding up the slopes by degrees, the ground softening beneath boots, the air changing its quality from the clean severity of cold to the complex richness of earth and growth and all the living things that had been waiting in suspension through the long winter for the permission that only warmth can give, and Marcus noticed these changes the way he had noticed everything on the mountain for 18 months, with attention and without comment, but the noticing had a different quality now, a quality that he had been aware of since the night of the blizzard and that had deepened through the winter and that he could name now in a way he had not been able to name it in December, could name it as the quality of noticing things you intend to keep, as opposed to the quality of noticing things you are simply recording. Because recording is what you do. And the difference between those two qualities of attention was the difference between the person he had been when he arrived on the mountain and the person who was standing on the porch in late March watching Atlas and Sable and Wren run in circles in the snow-thinned clearing while River watched them from beside his leg with the calm proprietary attention of a mother who has accounted for all three and found them satisfactory. Emily had brought her border collie Frost to the cabin for the first time in March, had brought him on a Tuesday visit with the matter-of-fact explanation that his mobility had declined enough in the past month that leaving him at the house alone for extended periods was something she was no longer comfortable doing, and Marcus had said, "Bring him whenever you come," and she had, and Frost had moved through the cabin with the dignified deliberateness of his 11 years and had found a position near the stove that he had apparently decided was his and had occupied it on every subsequent visit with the serene confidence of an animal who has assessed the available options and made a permanent choice, and Atlas and Sable and Wren had regarded him with the respect that young dogs extend to older dogs when the older dog carries himself in a way that makes the respect seem like the only reasonable response. Anne River had given him a single long assessing look on the first evening and then turned away, her assessment apparently complete and apparently favorable, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. What Marcus had built on the mountain was not what he had come to the mountain to build. He had come to build a life that asked nothing of him beyond the managing of it, a life reduced to its essentials, and what he had ended up building was something that asked considerably more than that and that he had found himself capable of considerably more than that in the building of it. And the gap between what he had come to build and what he had built was not a failure of the original intention but a revision of it, and the revision had been produced not by any single decision he had made but by the accumulation of small responses to what the mountain had placed in his path, the rope and the puppies and Emily Carr knocking on his door with her kit over one shoulder and River lying in the snow at the base of a pine tree and Clara Brandt sitting down beside an injured dog and calling for help, all of these things together constituting a kind of argument that the mountain had been making to him through the winter, an argument about what a life is for, about whether a life reduced to its essentials is actually a life at its most essential or a life missing something so fundamental that the reduction has become a form of damage, and Marcus had listened to the argument carefully in the way he listened to everything and had arrived at his own conclusion in his own time, which was that the thing the mountain had been sending him through the winter was not an interruption of the life he had come to build but a completion of it. He proposed to Emily on an evening in April when the last of the snow had retreated to the highest hollows and the clearing around the cabin was green and the evening light was the long gold of early spring and Atlas and Sable and Wren were somewhere in the trees and River was on the porch and Frost was inside by the stove. He proposed without ceremony and without the apparatus of romantic performance because neither of them were people who required ceremony or performance, and because the thing he was proposing had been true for long enough that the proposing of it was less a question than a confirmation, less a request than an acknowledgement, and Emily had been quiet for a moment after he said it, quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking through something completely before responding, and then she had said, yes, said it with the simple directness of a person who knows what they mean, and Marcus had thought about all the ways the mountain had been making its argument to him through the long winter, all the small moments of revision and accumulation that had brought him to this porch on this evening with this woman, and had understood that the argument had been correct and that his conclusion had been right and that the stone in his chest was gone, not displaced or managed but actually gone, replaced by something that was not its absence but its opposite, something that had weight and warmth and the specific quality of things that are genuinely yours. The trial of Gerald Fitch took place in May, and Marcus gave his testimony with the plain factual precision that the prosecutor had asked for, and that was his natural mode, and Emily gave hers with the same quality. Anne River was documented in the record with the fullness of a presence that could not be there in person but was present through every page of Emily's clinical documentation and through the statement that Marcus had written, and the outcome of the trial was the outcome that the evidence had made inevitable, and Petra Hollis stood outside the courthouse afterward and shook Marcus's hand and then Emily's hand and said, "River is the reason this held," and Marcus said, "River and Clara Brandt," and Petra said, "Yes, River and Clara Brandt," and they stood in the May sunshine for a moment, all of them, and then went about the rest of their day. The refuge that they built beside the cabin through the summer was Emily's idea and Marcus's execution and the community's contribution, and it grew from the conversations they had had through the winter about the gaps in the county's capacity for the animals that fell through them, the animals like River who existed in the spaces between the formal systems of rescue and shelter and law enforcement, animals whose situations required someone to act before the systems caught up, and what they built was not a replacement for those systems but a supplement to them, a place where the animals who needed somewhere to be while the systems caught up could be somewhere safe, and it had kennels built wide and warm and a treatment space that Emily had designed and a yard that was large and secure and a log over the door that read simply, "Refuge," which was what it was, both for the animals that came to it and for the people who built it and for the specific quality of life that it represented, which was a life that had made room for what it was given and had been made larger by the making of room. Atlas and Sable and Wren grew into the dogs that their first weeks of life had not made inevitable but had made possible because Marcus had found them before the cold took them and had sat on the floor of a Vermont cabin through a blizzard night rubbing warmth into 3 small bodies with the same hands that had done things in other places that he was still making peace with, and the peace he was making was made easier by this, by the dogs and by River and by Emily and by the mountain, and by the accumulation of small right choices that had been making themselves through the winter and that had produced by spring a life that was the right size for the person he was becoming, not the person he had been and not the person he had planned to be but the person the mountain had been arguing for through the long cold months, the person who opens the door when something needs opening, who sits on the floor when sitting on the floor is what the situation requires, who stays when staying is the only right thing, who trusts the readings of the instruments that have been calibrated by everything the years have sent, and who understands at last, completely and without reservation, that the rope that was meant to end something was instead the beginning of everything that mattered. River ran in the spring clearing with her 3 grown children on a morning in June when the mountain was at its fullest and the light was gold and the air was the complex richness of a Vermont summer morning. Ran with the specific joy of an animal who has learned that joy is available to her, learned it not quickly or easily but learned it completely and kept it with the completeness of something earned rather than given, and Marcus stood on the porch with Emily beside him and Frost at their feet and watched River run and thought about the night of the blizzard and the rope and the 3 small bodies and the stone in his chest that was gone now, gone and replaced by this, by the morning and the light and the running and the woman beside him and the understanding that the life you end up with is sometimes the life that arrives in the middle of the worst night the mountain can send and asks you to choose, and you choose, and the choosing is everything, and you find in the choosing that you were never as alone on the mountain as you believed yourself to be, and that the silence you came here for was never silence at all but simply the sound of the life that was waiting for you to be ready to live it.